So since what President Trump called Liberation Day, the word tariff has once again become fashionable. Perhaps as much as it was in 1947 or 1995, although for very, very different reasons. From what I could find online, compared with the same period last year, references to tariffs have risen dramatically, up to 92% in board calls, 350% in speeches by heads of state or government, 700% in newspaper and media articles, and an impressive 1,500% in Google searches. These figures and the fact that all of you are here show just how much interest there is in what tariffs are, how they function, and ultimately who pays for them. My name is Javier Gutierrez, and I'm a counselor here at the World Trade Organization. This afternoon, I will guide you through the complex world of tariffs. I am delighted to be joined in the panel by a distinguished multidisciplinary panel of experts who are ready to share their knowledge and answer your questions. Let me briefly introduce you to them. All the way at the other end is Anna Jerzewska, a leading expert in customs, trade facilitation, and international trade, and currently the Global Customs Director at DSV. She will provide insights into what tariffs represent from a customs perspective. Next to me, the infamous Dmitry Grosubinsky, a published author and the executive director of the Geneva Trade Platform, as well as an online trade personality. He will share his views on what tariffs mean in the geopolitical arena. Next to Anna, Professor Simon Evenet, one of the most recognizable figures in international trade, professor at the IMD Business School and founder of the St. Gallen Endowment for Prosperity Through Trade. He will talk us through the economic dimensions of tariffs. And in the middle, the conspirator for this afternoon session, Dr. Mona Paulsen. She's an assistant professor in law and political economy of trade at the London School of Economics, and she will reflect on the legal implications of tariffs. We will begin with an opening round of questions to our experts before inviting you, the audience, to join the conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time to ask the experts about tariffs. Simon, let me start with you. As an economist, could you take us to the very basics? What are tariffs? What is their incidence? And are they efficient?
Thanks, Javier, and it's great to be here. A tariff is a tax on the cross-border movement or importation of a good. The tax is not charged on the good if it moves within the country, only if it crosses the border. As a result, a tariff worsens the competitive position of firms based abroad trying to sell into the country imposing it, and it improves the competitive position of the firms inside the jurisdiction who compete against those foreign firms. So a tariff is a tax which alters the relative competitiveness of two types of firms. That's important for the set question of the incidence of a tariff. Normally we think about this in very simple terms that you have producers abroad who are now being taxed, and the question then is whether they can pass that on to the customers. How much that they can do that depends on how quickly the customers run away to other suppliers, okay? And it's an empirical question, who ultimately pays the taxes. Just to be clear, the importer always pays the tax, but the question is, can they pass it on to the customers, okay? In today's world, we have an interesting situation that the taxes paid by different foreign suppliers might be different. So there could be it could be differences in how they pass on the amount of tariff to others, and so the incidence could spread in different ways that we're not used to when we have uniform across the board tariffs. It's an empirical question how much the tariffs are passed on to customers, and of course if the tariff is across the board or there's extensive tariffs on many goods, then there can be price increases in many goods along many value chains, and then ultimately the cost of living rises, which creates an inflation effect as well. So the classic question of a tariff on a single good is different than when we have tariffs on many goods against many countries, which is the situation we have today. Then, as to efficiency, efficiency encourages us to think compared to what? So what is the purpose of a tariff? If the purpose of the tariff is to expand the local industry's size, then you have to ask the question, is there another policy instrument which could have the same outcome but at less cost? And one of the key findings from economic research is that a tariff imposes costs on downstream buyers, as well as providing extra revenue for local import competing firms, whereas you could get exactly the same effect with a subsidy that doesn't have the adverse price effect. So when compared to a production subsidy, or even sometimes a consumption subsidy, a tariff does much worse. So that's the sense in which economists think tariffs can be inefficient.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Anna, over to you. So Simon said that it is a tax that's paid when the goods effectively cross the border. So let's focus on what happens at the border. What role do tariffs play, and how are they applied in practice?
Okay, thank you, Javier. And I'll apologize in advance. I will be coughing throughout this presentation. Sorry about that. Simon mentioned that tariffs are paid by the importer, but the importer can be many different entities. Depending who's the importer, that entity pays tariffs. They can be passed on to the consumer, but they can also be passed to the supplier if the buyer has enough negotiating power to ask the supplier to take part of the costs. Before we get to the border, I'll just take one quick step back, just because I'd like to make this point that with what's been happening recently, the size of the tariffs, so the actual number, is one thing, but the way they have been implemented is actually sometimes even more challenging for businesses than the actual number. So before you actually get to the border, when you sell the goods, for the company selling the goods, the border element is just part of the process. It's just a bit of a hurdle to get over, but it's just a small part of the actual transaction. But what the seller would like to know, and what the buyer would like to know, is how much the goods are going to cost when they land, so the landed cost of goods. And for that, we like to know the tariff in advance, which recently has been quite difficult if you take into consideration that if you're shipping goods from China, they will take a while to get to the US, for example. So the amount of questions we had recently around, okay, my goods are somewhere on the ship, how much will it cost when they actually get to the US? And at what point can we have the certainty that this is the tariff that's going to be applied on that very day? So if you give people 2 days notice, that's not always enough. But when the goods actually get to the border, the way the tariffs are calculated, there's an entire data set called a customs declaration that is being submitted by someone like DSV, so a freight forwarder or customs broker, on behalf of the company. So the companies do not necessarily get involved in the border process themselves. And within that data set, you have a number of variables, like a commodity code for the product, the value of the product, and the origin, or actually 3 different types of origin, so where the product was made, where it's coming from, and so on. And based on that, we calculate the actual tariff. Again, here, when there are any changes, because all this happens automatically in an IT system, someone needs to update that IT system. And that's the job for customs officials in the US at CBP, the customs authorities in the US. You need to give them time to update their IT system. You need to give freight forwarders time to update their databases and their IT systems, because it needs to work smoothly when you put the data in. So again, recently the problems we've been having is things get put into the system incorrectly, not on time. We have a day notice, half day notice, then the policy gets reversed. You have to return the tariffs, companies need to apply for refunds, and so on. And the last point I'm going to make is that the more complicated you make your tariffs, the more legwork and paperwork this means for companies. So if you have tariffs that are different for different countries, and if you have tariffs on top of tariffs and added to other tariffs, and then if you have tariffs on the value or volume of certain material within the product, like steel and aluminum for derivative products. That means that all of a sudden, all those different elements of the data set, like origin, like classification, like data that we don't normally collect, become important and necessary. So the way it's been done now means that companies need to collect so much more data, and in certain cases they prefer to just pay the maximum amount of tariffs rather than get the discount that they should be getting, which is probably not the most efficient way to apply tariffs or do business. And I'll pause here.
Thank you, Anna. Maybe I just want to do a follow-up question. So you mentioned the case of China. What happens if when a ship loaded with cars, let's say, leaves China, and at that time the tariff rate is 10%. But when the ship arrives to its destination port, the tariff is all of a sudden 45%. Which one applies?
So one of my favorite part of every single executive order that's coming out of the US recently is the part where it says what the cutoff point is. So normally it does tell you exactly, like, to the actual hour at what point the goods get the higher tariff, the new tariff, or the lower tariff. So it does give you if the goods are on the water on that particular day at that particular time, you're with the old tariff. If they're after that, that's the new tariff. It's a small part of the executive orders, but if you look for it, it is actually there, and this is for most companies one of the most important parts within what's being published.
Great, thank you. Anna, you led me straight into the next question. This one's for Dimitri. Anna, you mentioned the executive order, so this is going to this is going to be our guiding star right now for this question. So Dimitri, since the 2nd of April, what role have tariffs played in geopolitics, and how has this changed from the role they have played in the past?
Thank you so much, Javier, and I will remember your introduction and formulate a suitable revenge in due course. I think from a geopolitical perspective, if you zoom out far enough, the idea of using tariffs and access to your market to try to shape the behavior of other states is not something that was invented on April 2. You can look at the European Union's GSP Plus program, which offers access to the European market if you sign on to certain provisions, international treaties, as an example of trying to shape behavior through tariffs. Free trade agreements, which are always politically motivated in terms of beginning the negotiations, often also have an attempt to shape behavior. What changed on April 2nd is a question of time and scale, as well as direction. Any of the things I have just listed were, for the most part, an incentive-based structure. If you do certain things, we will give you better access to our market than we enjoy today. For the most part, since April 2nd, we have been talking about a punitive structure. Secondly, it is a matter of speed. Most of the things I'm talking about are tied into months or sometimes even years-long processes, not waking up in the morning, checking Truth Social, and discovering if you still have a business. This kind of thing fundamentally changes the game. And then thirdly, I think there is a matter of the actor involved. If you think about what it takes to change the behavior of a foreign state by taxing your own citizens, that is actually a really high bar to clear. Your citizens need to be buying a lot of stuff that state needs to sell to you, cannot readily sell to others, and is willing to make certain concessions or certain changes to its regime in order to, or at least consider doing that, in order to mitigate. That is not the case for most states on Earth. So here, I think what has changed on April 2nd is a continuation of an attempt to use trade policy to shape behavior, which is not entirely unprecedented, but happening at a pace that we have never seen before, in a direction that we have rarely seen, though it's not completely unprecedented, and by one of the few actors on Earth that can make a really good go of it, and do it in a way that is both disruptive, has a chance to really make states pause and say, we need to at least consider sort of making concessions, and is so large that retaliation is not an automatic no-brainer as it would be if a smaller state attempted to leverage the power of its economy in a coercive way. So I think that's the overall picture.
Great, thank you. Mona, now over to you. Let's bring tariffs to the actual place where we are, the WTO. How do they fit into the WTO's framework, and what can members do with them and their bound rates, their commitments?
Thank you so much, Javier. And thank you to all of you for participating in this panel, by the way. I'm really grateful. So I get to be the straight talking, let's talk about the rules and the multilateral framework part now. But also trying to bring in together what was said by Simon and by Anna and Dimitri into the context of the structuring of how typically governments negotiate their tariffs. So for most of you in the room, it will not surprise you to learn that, of course, the WTO does not prohibit the imposition of tariffs. The idea here is that tariffs are set by a WTO member and is put within their national tariff. And they commit to ceilings. And Article 2 of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, binds those ceilings. And so you make those commitments and you continue to have a process of negotiation, a tariff schedule. With that central binding pursuant to Article 2, there is, of course, rules pertaining to the negotiation process and the ongoing rounds of that process, which we saw throughout the GATT period from 1947 to 1994 and subsequent. So, of course, any government, any member, can renegotiate their tariffs. That is a part of the system. But there are also, in addition to these commitments and obligations, central norms that are inherent, plus also not just a norm or an idea, but a rule of most favored nation, also tethered to the idea of reciprocity. So the most favored nation then applies to allow all members on an equal basis, pursuant also to those negotiations. So exactly how it sounds, I don't want to be patronizing, but the importance of this seems to be really valuable now as we begin to question, what does MFN mean? Isn't it already further eroded all the time? There is within this architecture a key principle that you treat all your trading partners, all their products that are like, in the same way, in countries and non-discrimination, non-arbitrary discrimination. And so even if we begin to deviate with preferential trade agreements and other arrangements, it is upheld as if a skeleton upholds all of our muscles through that structure, that central idea of most favored nation principle, an unconditional one. Now, of course, then when we begin to think of the renegotiation process, there is, of course, within the system, not just the ability to negotiate preferential trade agreements or generalized system of preferences, as Dimitri mentioned, but of course, we've seen how that negotiation process allows for limited discrimination, for example, with the way that we have fine product distinctions within our schedule. So of course, how we classify tariffs, how we introduce them and organize them matters quite succinctly as well. A really classic example of this, maybe I'll actually talk about in questions. But to return to the idea of renegotiation, the final point I want to make is that the renegotiation procedures are efficient. They're supposed to allow a renegotiating country that seeks to modify or alter that concession to do so with a limited group. There are only specific groups that they can do it with, and then move on. And through that process, they are meant to negotiate, develop a mutually satisfactory agreement, renegotiate their concessions. If you need to change market access, you reciprocate that in terms of the cost for the other party. And there is, of course, embedded within that an opportunity, if you can't come to an agreement, to retaliate. The retaliation is a complement to this system because, of course, any government is free to alter their schedule. That then they can withdraw the equivalent concession. And there's, of course, then we get into the legality of what does it mean by equivalence and how we develop that process. But of course, any member that wants to make a change is free to do so. But it is this structured process for that renegotiation that, of course, we didn't see, as we're talking about the United States here, I know quite a bit, but the United States opted to, within their new tariff strategy, their proposal to make those changes not through the WTO process and the procedures of Article 28, but instead to go outside that process to bargain their tariffs bilaterally, to avoid the MFN commitment, and to do so with added Dimitri's point of pressure, to do so in a punitive way. And in fact, the executive orders stressed that if there was an effort to respond, if there was an effort to not proceed with the terms by which the United States had set, that there would be a further higher tariffs. So in fact, any coordination, any effort to pause or pull back or respond or retaliate would of course be met with higher tariffs. And that is beyond the efficiency and the process that is within the system that the United States, of course, committed to, and of course Congress delegated that authority to have. So it's a very different process. Now, of course, if there is a violation of any of these commitments, a member is free to justify those inconsistent actions. And we can get further into the questions about the complex blurring of objectives that have come out from the rationale for why it was necessary to bargain these tariffs down, which is a separate question. But of course, there are very significant mixed objectives, which make it very difficult for any negotiating partner to identify what it is that the United States wanted to achieve, wanted to concern. So when you initiate a tariff bargain, usually it's we need to protect this particular product, this particular sector, and there is a negotiation. But if you don't necessarily know what the party wants to achieve, it can be very difficult to have that bargaining process at all. And of course, what we've seen then, this is my final point, Simon introduced a very important distinction between production subsidies and consumption subsidies as well versus a tariff. The other really important element to think about in terms of the United States' current tariff strategy, as not only is it a deviation from the World Trade Organization's architecture, but what we're seeing is an interesting point in terms of the way that they are shaping then their approach to the protection of their domestic industries, not through subsidization within the government offering these subsidies, but through investment pledges, not for all members, of course, but some, which we haven't yet determined the full ramifications of. We've only begun to see certain ideas of what it means. But this, of course, would take us significantly outside of the WTO architecture altogether in terms of how the rules with respect to subsidies are governed, or even investment agreements. So this takes us into a dramatically different area beyond the scope of the WTO as we know it. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mona. While you were doing this like very short university course, which I appreciate and found extremely enlightening. I thought of two things caught my attention. First, you mentioned that when renegotiations were to begin, it's with a small group.
Yep.
Those groups are dictated by those members that have INRs, correct?
Not just INR.
So can you tell us a bit about that?
Okay, so pursuant to Article 28, and actually Article 28 is, and there are subsequent understandings that help map out that entire procedure. So there's a whole process with respect to that. So there are members that hold initial negotiating rights. Those are INRs, that was mentioned by Javier. Then there are those that have principal supplying interests in the changes that are being proposed by the applicant member. Then there are those that have a substantial interest in the tariff changes. Now, there are negotiation requirements for those that have INRs and for the principal suppliers. Those that have substantial interests there is a requirement that the applicant member consult with them. So it is different than negotiation. There is a consultation process. However, we don't have a full definition of what substantial interest means. There is no formal definition, but a general acceptance of a 10% import share benchmark. However, even that could be necessarily, it's not a formal definition. So how we define a substantial interest in our highly interdependent period of economic globalization could be a different discussion. And then, of course, we have separate provisions with respect specifically to developing countries, so they are another important applicant group. But that it is important to appreciate that even within the system, it is not all 166 members that participate in that change. There are specific parties, but of course, even still, that is still dramatically different from the process of the bilateral bargaining that we've been seeing.
And I had a follow-up question, not entirely on this, but so we have been discussing the case of the United States, but the United States has entered into agreements with other WTO members. These other WTO members will probably also deviate from their MFN principles.
Depending on who you ask.
Can you please elaborate on that?
So, I think members are so here I sit as the academic and some of you in the room are actually in the delegation, so forgive me as what I observe. It is a very difficult question, but obviously the idea is that if you are going to respond to the United States and set 0% on all of your products, that you do so on an MFN basis to all members. And if you are not, and you're according preferential treatment to the United States outside the scope of the preferential rule with respect to shaping a regional trade area or a free trade area or a customs union, you are outside of that commitment. The other interesting element to this, of course, is what happens to those members that have existing agreements with the United States. And this raises another really important question that the four of us have been constantly talking about, which is what does it mean to think about those? Now, you could think about the USMCA, which is the agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. In many ways, the existence of that agreement helped those governments because they then were protected by USMCA compliance. But we didn't know what USMCA compliance meant, and I really hope Anna will come in here to talk about the delicate nature of those that previously had not done the documentation to show USMCA compliance. And so that is at a substantive cost, even if there was that initial protection. So I hope she chimes in on that. But what we don't know now are important questions about what it means to transport through an intermediary country, what the United States has called transshipment. We don't have a formal definition of what they think that means. And of course, for the South Korea, for the Koreans, for Chorus, that agreement seemed to disappear. I don't know if Simon, if someone wants to chime in, or Dimitri. So there was almost an automatic process, and the USMCA was subject to renegotiation next year, and that procedure has actually just started. They've started the consultancy process for that. And so now we will see what that means, whether it means annual reviews, which has a huge impact on firms within all three countries, or not. And in terms of what it means now, particularly what happens when you bargain with the United States makes asks and demands in the bargaining process that will cause a country to be in violation of its WTO obligations, is a delicate question of balancing domestic interests and their international commitments. We haven't fully seen what the outcomes are because, luckily, all of these agreements have been informal. So once we begin to see the full implementation, we'll have a better sense of whether there are violations.
Thank you. And this question, I'm throwing it to the rest of the panel. What happened to these agreements? What happened to the FTAs with these new executive orders? Do they still exist? Do they still apply?
Yeah? Yeah, Anna.
I can just add to this that at the beginning, throughout the last couple of months, one of the ways, if not the only way for me to understand what happened to those agreements was actually to call a customs broker in the US and ask them to enter the code into the US customs IT system and tell me what it's saying. Because there was no official information about what happened to this agreement. We were discussing this amongst ourselves and thinking, do they still apply, do they not apply? But at the end of the day, for the actual amount of money you have to pay as an importer, it's what's in the system. And what's in the system and so what's in the executive order are not always the same things, which does not make things easier for traders.
All right, thank you. I think we've had a very good crash course on what tariffs are and what their implications are. I hope this has clarified some of the questions that you may have had when you walked here into the atrium today. But now we are flipping the table and we want to hear from you. So just some quick pointers to keep the conversation dynamic. When I approach you and give you over my microphone, please begin by introducing yourself and the organization you represent. Please direct your question to a specific expert. They have lovely names next to them. Keep your questions short and precise. And finally, please refrain from making statements. If you do, I will interrupt you, as this takes time away from others who may want to ask questions. So, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is yours. It is now your chance to ask the experts. I see a very eager lady with a red jumper. Here.
Now, question to Evelyn. Nice to see you, Lee. What are the impacts of all of this on international trade?
Can you remind us?
Vera Torstensen from Brazil.
Thank you.
Ex-WTO Brazilian mission for 20 years. Nice to see the destruction of the system after 20 years. Nice.
On that cheery note, Simon?
So the impact has been to reduce significantly Chinese exports to the United States, principally. We have seen up until now about 52 billion less in terms of exports compared to last year over the same first 8 months of the year. We have seen some redirection of those exports to other markets. Once the import data for August, September, October comes through, by November we should be in a position to be able to talk about how much the exports of other countries are falling to. There will be, of course, some impact of the 10%, which was put in place from the 2nd of April. So a general, essentially, slowdown of trade, if not a contraction along some bilateral trade routes. So that's one part. The other part to add is, of course, a significant increase in tariff uncertainty, and this has led to the postponement of many decisions, including plant relocations, plant shutdowns, investment, and alike, which is probably having more of a macroeconomic effect in different jurisdictions. In terms of the impact on the United States, we are beginning to see price increases in key in imported items. There's some very nice data showing that upstream costs and prices are rising faster, and they're now working their way down towards final consumer goods. So this is beginning to work through in terms of higher inflation. And we will see that dynamic. And then, of course, the question will be, to what extent do Americans revise their expectations about future inflation, which is typically how higher levels of inflation get locked in until central banks move aggressively against it. There.
I saw some hands.
Trinish Biswas with the WTO Secretariat. This question is for Anna. It's kind of the microeconomic side of some of the questions Simon was asking, issues Simon was talking about. How are your clients respond? What are the different ways your clients are responding to like complex customs rules, higher costs? Like, are you seeing them do different things? You said some pay the full tariffs, or others just sort of saying maybe we don't sell there anymore, or how are they responding? Thanks.
Yeah, Simon made a really good point about people, our companies, being slightly reluctant to make any decisions at this point, investment decisions. I think that's a very good point to stress. That's especially for the first couple of months, the ink was, the pen was a couple of centimeters from the paper waiting to sign contracts. There was a lot of kind of holding responses. So, for example, in the UK, some of the companies agreed with their clients in the US to take some of the tariffs upon themselves, so take half of the tariffs and pay half of the tariffs instead of the importer. But they did it for a couple of months for the initial period because everyone, well, not everyone, but I think a lot of people expected these tariffs to eventually go away. In the first couple of months, no one really thought of this as being a continuous trade policy for the next 4 years, which is, I think, where we now are what we're now preparing for. So that's one option, dividing the margins, finding workarounds in terms of potentially moving parts of the productions to the US, finding other markets. There's unfortunately, we talked about transshipment, there's unfortunately part of the market that is trying to find ways around the tariffs that are not necessarily compliant, which is what the US customs authorities are warning against with transshipment. So the responses vary, but in terms just of what the private sector went through, I mean, imagine in the middle of August or some point in August, you're introducing 407 new tariff lines that are subject to different tariffs. People are on a holiday. No one's got time. Like, who within the company has time to keep track on everything? For all four of us, that's been pretty much our full-time job since January. But if you work for a company, you actually have a full-time job, and then someone needs to do this on top of that. So who within the company can track and make sure that they're on top of things? So it's been very, very stressful for companies. It's been very stressful for service providers. It's just been quite busy, I think, for everyone in the industry. But we'll see how long we can, continue on that basis.
Before I give the floor to somebody else, Anna, rules of origin, what role are they playing now?
That's everything. What are they?
Sorry?
What are
rules of origin?
Yes.
What role are they playing now? Are they still relevant?
Rules of origin are always relevant, and if you want to sit here for the next 4 hours, I'll give you a brief overview of how they work. So, okay, very quickly, one of the impacts of tariffs, of these new US tariffs, is that we have a different set of rules of origin that became important. It's not a new set of rules, but it's one that has not been so relevant in the past. So, and again, please don't get me started, but we have the origin that we use for free trade agreements to get a discount, and we have the other origin, non-preferential origin, which unless you're paying, there's ADDs or some other special duties, has not been so important, and particularly in the US case, it's not necessarily very well defined. There's not much guidance, and all of a sudden, this is, because we have this difference between different countries in terms of tariffs, this is crucial. And companies are not used to dealing with this. How do you explain to a customs officer in the US that he's getting an Irish whiskey with UK origin? What do? Do they stop it? Do they apply UK tariff? Do they apply EU tariff? It's these kind of questions that make it very interesting for importers and exporters, and their goods often get stopped.
Thank you.
Hello, Guy Rulle from FMC. I have a question for Simon and for Mona. Building on what you said, Simon, about inflation starting to be visible in the United States, and also what Dimitri said before, that what we've seen are a lot of unilateral tariffs from the US, but not much retaliation, so that the other countries around the world, they don't really retaliate, right? So you're going to have one country that suddenly is going to insulate itself with higher tariffs, and therefore higher prices, and logically less competitive than the rest of the world market. My question is, what's the next thing that's going to happen on the world market? How will this play out for the US and all other countries in the world in terms of trade?
So let me start. I was interested in where you were going to land, and so I think I'm going to run. I don't know if I'm going to run in the direction you have in mind, but I think what we are looking at, precisely as the US economy becomes less and less competitive, and it does not fundamentally address its deep supply-side flaws, its education system, which is crummy, hiring and firing culture, which does not seem to work with long-term manufacturing. The list could go on. And the list, by the way, comes from European businesses who've tried to do business in the United States and have found it very difficult. I think what we're going to see is that Fortress America will become Fortress North America. with both Canada and Mexico being encouraged to, as part of the USMCA renegotiation, to essentially become an area which is pretty much cut off from the rest of the trading system. Then I think the interesting question is whether pressures in other parts of the world will start building up. I am keeping a very close eye on the European Union for the simple reason that since I teach at a business school where lots and lots of European companies come through, they are finding the pressure from Chinese competition so intense that pressures are building up for some type of trade restrictions here. I do not think it will be a fortress scenario in the sense of across the board, but I would not be surprised if many products, manufacturing products, where there is a potential security dimension, will become ones which will fall under regulations which just so happen to keep out exports from certain East Asian countries. So I think we will see a response there. By the way, none of these developments are ones I would want to see, but I think that is what we will see. So that may well unfold. So I think we are only at the beginning of this. The dominoes, the tariff dominoes, are just beginning to fall.
And you asked me as well. So yesterday in a separate panel on multilateral trading system, I talked about a proposal that I had done with another Canadian trade economist on collective action. One of the things that I was most surprised about was after the series of tariffs that were imposed, and I think it's really important to note that so far we've set April 2nd as a date, but the United States has begun this process years before, in 2016, with their initial tariffs on the basis of security for aluminum and steel. And in addition to the tariffs posed under the act, which I like to call the Never-Ending Emergency Act, that's not its title, but is essentially created a never-ending emergency in justifying sweeping country-by-country tariffs on countries, tariffs on their schedules. We see this idea of creating a huge architecture of violations in many different ways, not just for economic security, but one that fundamentally would alter the system to be not objective characteristics of a product by which we distinguish and market and negotiate, even though, as Dimitri notes, there's always geopolitics as a part of this question, but one that could potentially see selective discrimination based on origin. And as Anna suggested, how far does that go? How do we understand where something is made? Do we consider the people that made that input or that product, their nationality, their origin? How far do we go? So this is the never-ending part of this question of how far will we go in making these bargains and these distinctions. And currently within the United States, they're trying to understand whether that authority is actually limited in some way, and we don't know the full outcome of that obviously yet. That'll be a question for the Supreme Court. But this question of how we classify tariffs objectively, or rather one based solely on discrimination, is one that all countries are faced with. I was surprised that we did not see more cases brought to the WTO, more objections. We had a very limited number. And there was this question yesterday on the panel I was on last night of why didn't we see more countries, right? And why was there this preference to bargain with the United States? Is it because their market is so huge and so important that this was the necessary action, probably a part of it? But it's obviously a question of why don't we see banding together? And one of the key bylines, if you don't listen to the podcast, though I recommend that you do, otherwise Chris will get mad if I don't plug it, is that there is an obligation amongst the membership. You are all stronger. I sound so corny when I say this, but I get to be corny, right, Javier? You are all stronger together, and joint action is embedded within the system to pursue collective action. And the paper is about bringing a situation complaint, which talks about the situation of global economic uncertainty, because this was hinted by Simon. It is the uncertainty, and Anna suggested, the unknown of when things will change on a dime, that is the problem, that makes it impossible for producers to be able to plan, not even 2 days from now, but definitely not 5 years from now or 2 years from now.
Thank you. For those of you that are wondering, the podcast that Mona was alluding to
Yes, I did not give
is called Trade Bites by the University of Sussex and the Center for International For inclusive trade policy.
Yes, inclusive trade policy, CITP, by the University of Sussex. I want to plug them.
And
Michael's here.
Before I give the floor for the next question, I wanted to ask something based on what Simon and Mona just said. So we're witnessing a change in the equilibrium. Several parameters have changed. The markets have not adjusted themselves yet. In an ideal world, the water should calm itself eventually. However, like Mona said, this could be a never-ending emergency. Do you see this equilibrium ever happening, or is the end the fortress of North America that you mentioned, Simon?
So I have a very clear answer here, because, and I think this is where some of the discussions in this town go off the rails. What we're in a situation now is we have a number one power that sees its primacy challenged. It took the United States 40 years to beat the Soviet Union. It took them around 15 years to beat Japan. They are in this for a multi-decade fight for their primacy. It's clear that their security and their primacy dominates their interest in trade rules and commerce. So this lasts as long as the contest for primacy lasts. And that's why when I talk to senior executives, I'm encouraging them to think in decade-long terms, where we now enter a period of what the people who think about this stuff more seriously call deep uncertainty, where we don't know what the outcomes are, we don't even know what the probabilities of different outcomes are, we don't know the paths, and we can't even agree on any of it. And there is a way to make decision-making during periods like this, and it's not one which is particularly consistent with all the stability and rules and norms which Mona so eloquently laid out. And that is where we're at. That's my view. Think decades. This is a contest about primacy. This has got very little to do with trade. Is secondary to this. And so we have been through a very special period in the first 30 years of the WTO. That period is over.
Well, thank you. Peter Kirkegaard from the Confederation of Danish Industry, and I can attest to all of the difficulties. We are trying to guide our member companies on how to deal with this, and it's extremely difficult. Two questions, one for Anna. I'm curious to hear, have you seen a sort of a downturn in the amount of cargo that you're sending to the US, just as a way of seeing whether the tariffs actually have a negative impact on trade? And then another question, and I don't know to whom, but there are some ideas in the US and USTR about switching from rules of origin to rules of ownership, in the sense that if a good comes from Europe and it's produced by a Chinese-owned company here, it would have a different tariff compared to if it was produced by a European company. What are your thoughts on this, both maybe the WTO legality of that, but also the practicalities of it? Thank you.
Anna, do you want to go first?
So, unfortunately, I don't have the most recent data or enough data to answer this, but also for the last couple of months, the data will not be accurate because we had a lot of front-loading. So we need a lot, and I think, Simon, you mentioned this in some of your papers as well. Simon is a great source for all things data, but we'll need to a bit of a longer period of time to see exactly, because if you know that tariffs on lumber are coming, you will try to strip as much lumber as possible. We do know that customs warehousing in the US is an issue, so and any kind of storage is booked. There's no space to store more goods in the US from the warehouses that we have, so there's definitely a lot of that happening.
I can try the second question. I am curious how they imagine that working in practice. I can't speak to the WTO legality, but working out who exactly owns anything and where that company is based. I mean, what makes a company Chinese? What percentage of shares held by whom? Is it Chinese nationals? Is it Chinese companies? It's a conglomerate that's part of a conglomerate that's wholly owned by a holding company that's owned by another conglomerate that's channeling through a loan that's wholly owned by an independent company. The only thing complicated than trying to work out what exact percentage of the steel in a car part entering from Mexico into North America is American is to work out what percentage of incredibly complicated corporate ownership structure is genuinely from one of the countries you care about. So I can't speak to legality, but I'm not entirely sure they've had a conversation with Anna about what this would look like at the borders before floating that.
Yeah, and I want to let Simon have a chance to respond. I will say that the interesting question to that is, if one member suddenly changes its approach, I mean, what does that mean for all the other members that continue to abide by rules of origin and have through their own domestic systems? We certainly know that from the assessment of what is a public body within the subsidies rules, how difficult it is to understand the differences of control and vested authority. And obviously that's a huge, longer conversation that I won't get into here. But we know from that practice and that litigation how complicated it can be in terms of understanding how governments approach vested authority and control. And we certainly know in the international investment law space how difficult it is to define nationality for investors and investments. And that is a massive question in terms of understanding jurisdiction and the applicability. And it is not a complex, simple question. And ultimately, I think this comes back to Anna's point, is who is going to be doing this work? Who is going to be investigating whether something is made from somewhere or is owned by someone else? I genuinely am curious to see whether they have the manpower to do this. And that is a separate question altogether, or whether they expect private companies to take on that added obligation. And then how do they show the customs border officials that they've undertaken that in an equivalent way that the United States would be satisfied? But I'll let Simon.
So I think you have to go inside why they're doing this. And so the message, I think, is pretty clear. If you're a Chinese firm, don't export to the United States. If you're a firm that buys Chinese stuff and you want to ship it to the US, don't do that. The fact that the rules are unclear, I mean, there are data sets on ultimate beneficiary owners. It's messy. But the fact that it's unclear is by design. It's by design to create uncertainty. And so essentially, through lots of different devices, we are, the message is being clear, is being very clear. Foreign countries can engage with China, but they will not be able to use any of that engagement in their transactions with Fortress North America, which is where we're headed. And I see this as all part of the piece of trying to separate out the relationships between the number one and the number two power. And the rest of us are caught up in it.
Thank you for the excellent panel. My name is James Nedambara from the Center for Trade and Investment in New Delhi. So my question is actually with respect to the trade agreements. The United States has got so many free trade agreements, but the USMCA has got a particular status. It is actually the most preferred agreement where products can still come at the 0% duty. The United States has signed so many other free trade agreements. So what is actually going to those free trade agreements? Because there is actually a unilateral increase of duties from 0 to maybe 10 or 15 or whatever rate for that matter. So are we to assume that these free trade agreements are actually meaningless at this moment? They have been frustrated. That is one question. The second question is actually with respect to Mona's paper on this collective retaliation or collective remedies. I read your paper in the Yale Journal as well. So my question is this one. Even if you want to file a situation complaint before the WTO, the United States can still argue that it is a national security matter, the panel doesn't have jurisdiction, and they may not even turn up. And again, even if you win the matter will be taken up for an appeal before the appellate body. It can be appealed into the void. There won't be any effective remedy at the end of the day. But why don't you consider the second option, which is actually the non-violation, nullification, and impairment? And the United States had actually come out with a proposal saying that if you can compute the quantum of the nullification and impairment, there is still an opportunity for rebalancing the obligation under the GATT. So I just want these two questions.
Okay. So, with respect to the proposal for collective action, it's not collective retaliation. And it's really important to make that distinction. The situation complaint would not involve the United States. So therefore, there is not a question of their involvement. Could they still block the final panel report through the DSB? Yes, pursuant to the rules they could. But it is not a collective retaliation against the United States. A situation complaint proposed by those governments that wish to band together to try to address the economic uncertainty situation is to offer an opportunity for them to have a panel issue recommendations of how to address that situation, whether it requires discrete, in-the-moment questions with respect to how to handle these, new notifications, safeguard mechanisms that have to be put into place, those that perhaps don't allow them to act as swiftly, but through a panel recommendation, through the neutral arbitral process within the framework of the WTO, they're able to address that situation collectively. Attenuating harm is distinct from retaliating or trying to re-invoke Article 28.3 of the retaliation process, simply because some governments are not going to find that the retaliation process under 28.3, even if it was reignited, would help them in any way. Simply if you're a small country and you can't withdraw the concessions, it's not of benefit to you. Attenuating harm, though, in trying to address improved notification or scope for review of things that have to be done with respect to diversification that's caused by the economic uncertainty by one or several members of the WTO, could be something that would be beneficial. A non-violation complaint and an origin for nullification or impairment implies that those governments are conceding that the United States has not violated its commitments to the WTO. Simply addressing that to have the rebalancing mechanism, you can approach the rebalancing mechanism bilaterally with the United States. They're open to that. But what you have to give will be significantly higher. Seeking a non-violation, they have not proposed to use the system as it stands because the way that you would prove a non-violation complaint within the WTO is actually quite hard to do, and I can't go into the specifics. They would have to create a new mechanism specifically for the United States to be able to facilitate the kind of non-violation complaints that they propose. But with the 232, the tariffs, certain tariffs on steel and aluminum products that came out in 2023, Switzerland and Norway had that opportunity. The United States, because they hadn't treated them like safeguards and hadn't retaliated instantaneously, there was an opportunity, the United States said, to rebalance. You would have to ask those delegations if the United States ever followed through. So this question of going to just rebalancing and turning it into an efficient, let's just exchange and cut a deal, is one members may choose to do. But of course, then it comes with not aligning with the other members that are equally harmed, not taking consideration of other small open economies that are affected, and conceding that the United States has not violated its obligations, which, as all trade policies are a trade-off, that may be the trade-off that governments are willing to make. I don't know.
Teresa Carpenter. My questions are to Simon. So, based on something said by Kellyanne yesterday with the US having a goal to become more of a production economy, based on the conversations you have at the business school, to what extent do you see any surge in interest in inward investment into the US? And if there would be such inward investment, to what extent do you see this might increase jobs in the way that's supposedly desired based on the kind of the technological changes that are going on in manufacturing that I'm sure you're also very familiar with in your work? Thank you.
So the way that what I'm hearing from businesses thinking about for whom the US market is important and who have been up until now exporting maybe from Europe or from elsewhere to the United States, the question becomes, should they establish a production facility in the US or in Mexico and Canada? And this is where the outcome of Fortress North America becomes important. There is significant reluctance to invest in the United States without major subsidies, given, and even then, there are major operational problems on recruitment of talent, retention of talent, permitting, all of these reasons why greenfield FDI into the United States has been a trickle for a decade or so, for a long time. By the way, the headline numbers for FDI into the US also include cross-border M&A. Lots of European and other companies like buying a slice of American oligopoly. That's not what President Trump has in mind. He wants new factories. Then when you get to setting up a new factory, as you hint in your question, with the rise of robots, the extent to which you can replace these difficult, hard to manage, hard to retain workers with robots, that will be the incentive, which is very clearly there. So the job payoff will be quite minimal. Okay? Now you're all sitting there thinking, well, then why are they doing it? Well, they're doing this, and so here's another very important lesson that I've taken from the last year or so. When I see a problem like deindustrialization, I want to fix it. Many American politicians, I think, want to keep using the grievances associated with deindustrialization as their calling card in presidential election after presidential election after presidential election. So I think it is a false assumption to think that they would necessarily put in place policies which will fix this problem. They just want to look like they're fixing this problem and hope that people don't notice.
Can I just add one thing too? It's also really telling that in establishing the manufacturing base, there's an interesting question about regulatory processes that are changing dramatically within the United States right now. So that's another thing to bear in mind in consideration of this. And I don't know with respect to all areas, but we know with at least respect to AI digital sovereignty that there is specific language that we saw just a few days ago from, I believe it was an executive order, perhaps a proclamation, dispelling international standards and global governance, which is a huge question for multinational corporations. As Dimitri said, these are not solely domestic ones. And that is another question then, what happens if you do business with the United States and you do want to be a leader in setting international standards, which are so vital for establishing predictability within these markets?
Just one quick thing to add, which is a challenge for the US system is that it is inherently short-term. Presidential cycles are very fast. They don't seem to end anymore. Congressional cycles, when you layer them on top of that, you are constantly in an election cycle, and that forces short-term thinking. The challenge of deindustrialization, reindustrialization, even if you look at it from the best faith possible, and you posit as a premise that the lack of factories or the lack of factory employment is a problem that needs solving, as Simon has alluded to a number of times in his earlier answers, for the most part, this is driven by long-term structural factors. Chinese supremacy, it's very easy to say that Chinese manufacturing supremacy is just a matter of subsidies. Like you can just write a check and suddenly the Midwest will be covered in factories and the rust will fall off the Rust Belt. That is not true. In many cases, subsidies played a role, almost certainly, but it is decades of process improvement. It is a particular regulatory regime. It is bazillions of dollars investment in big infrastructure. It is a lot of things that take decades. And I think if you take a much more benign position than Simon did there, even if you look at it with the best will in the world, it is an attempt to apply short-term solutions to a problem that require long-term thinking.
So why do they lie, Dimitri?
It's easy, fun, and profitable, as you are seeing me demonstrate.
Hannes Schliermann of WT Advisors. I have just 15 and a half questions. I'm starting with number 1, ending at 16. No, just one. De-risking from the United States is a phrase that you hear now, right, left, and center. So if everybody de-risks, and Simon, you just confirmed that that's what any reasonable person right now would not invest, would try to not trade, because you don't know when you ship your goods today and 2 weeks later it might arrive and the cutoff date may be passed. So if everybody de-risks from the United States and has to do that, who's half rational, that would logically need some sort of isolation. So you have the fortress, perhaps sort of, it's a COVID bubble, Mexico and Canada get in or out. And then the question is, what happens next? So what will the world look like outside of that bubble? Will there be some calming? Will everybody else be able to de-risk from the United States? That would have to be disastrous for the US in the, not just the long term, the medium term. Is that going to happen? Is that actually happening? Or are we looking at some sort of cyclical bounce back scenario sometime soon?
I'll keep this very brief. Look, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist. So let me give you another way of looking at this. If you're a foreign country, not the US, and you're trading with the US, I mean, we have a highly globalized world, which could be even more globalized. Right? Many countries have lots of trading partners. This country has a bit of a trade drama with the United States, but only 1 in 7 of its exports goes to the United States. So it should be possible to find ways, find new customer segments in new geographies, many of which are growing faster than the United States, to over time reduce your dependence on this market. And just to be utterly fair, okay, just to be utterly balanced about this, in my view, we might have more than one rogue big player in the world trading system, and that I would advise any government or any company to ask whether or not they should diversify from both of these rogues. And if your list of
Get out of New Zealand, guys.
Yeah, if your list of rogues is longer than 2, add that. But the key thing is we're in a world with lots and lots of trading jurisdictions, and I think one of the mistakes that we've fallen into is to think that you have to have a huge export exposure to these big players. There are lots and lots of players out there, so let's try globalization.
At the same time, just to very quickly add to this, a lot of companies don't think in a strategic way. If they can still sell to the US and they can make some sort of profit, they will. It's also a very much case-by-case basis. So for a company, it's not sell or don't sell. It's do we sell that particular product line? Is there interest in that? What are our competitors doing? So it's a lot of business case and kind of calculating profits, margins, and so on for different products. But companies still want to sell to the US. They're making less profit, but if they can sell, they will still sell. Business will always find a way. It's going to be more expensive, it's going to be more paperwork, but business will continue and companies will continue to trade. Yeah? It's just going to be a little bit less profitable.
Okay, we have time for one more.
Thank you. My name is Sahana, and I am from the UK Trade Policy Observatory at the University of Sussex. My question is to Anna. How has the introduction of targeted tariffs like the Section 301 tariffs impacted the rates for dual-use goods? And has there been a reinventing of customs classification procedures, particularly for these goods?
I think this is an excellent question that I should be charging for in terms of the answer. This is a consulting question that I might need to send an invoice to someone for. I'm not actually sure if Simon would be a better place to introduce, like answer some of the data stuff and the flows. I think you might have more data.
We might have more data, but I mean, the idea that the number of products listed as dual use is just expanding. This is a first order question. We should charge for the answer.
So, excellent question. We will charge you for that. We know where you are.
Okay, thank you very much. Just before closing the panel, I have one last question to all the panelists. Mona probably already thought of this because she was. Are we in a world where we will stop negotiating by tariff line? Is there harmonized system something from the past, and are we just looking at negotiations from country to country? Quick 30-second answer.
We are definitely going to be seeing both. Governments are going to want to micro-target their tariffs by tariff line, and they're going to want to get increasingly precise about where their tariffs go. So they're going to want to both negotiate by tariff line and by country. I think, as Simon says, the by country stuff is likely to be focused around a single epoch-defining geostrategic conflict between the US and China and their respective spheres of influence. But I think tariff lines aren't going anywhere either.
Well, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Okay, no? It seems no? No? Okay. Sorry, I cut them off on my own question. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you so much for the panelists. I hope you had a thoughtful afternoon. And on behalf of the WTO Secretariat, thank you so much for joining us in the public forum. Have a good afternoon.